podcast from Open Letter and 3%, in which we take a single book, talk about it bit by bit, section by section over a couple month period, breaking it down, making it entertaining, doing all that fun stuff, making a bunch of jokes. As always, I'm joined by Brian Wood, who is vacationing this week.
Hi, Chad. I'm so great to be here during my vacation. Appreciate it.
Are you hungover this time? We did this last year at the same time, and you had like beer, bourbon, wine, absinthe.
I just did 3, so I'm good now. I only did 3 different types, so I'm fine.
That's a plus. That's a plus. And I know that Brian is going to have to, as a warning to anyone watching this live, or maybe listening, he's going to have to run out at some point to catch a boat because he lives the boating lifestyle.
Well, it's a pontoon boat, so it's not that glamorous.
Still. And we're also joined this week by Ryan Chapman, who is officially used to work at BOM, used to work at FSG, and is now officially just a full-time writer.
Yes. Hello, everybody.
How is it being a full-time writer?
It's very nice. My stress levels went down, and then they were replaced by different stresses. But it's nice. Every morning I get up whenever I want. I reread the corrections. I meditate. All the things that they say you're supposed to do for a healthy lifestyle.
Joke will become more clear as time goes on, I'm sure. So you have the one book out, the Spark Notes, right? The trivia.
Yeah, Conversation Sparks. Yeah, and then my novel is coming out next May, at the end of May.
Who's publishing it?
Simon & Schuster.
Awesome!
Oh, congratulations!
Yeah, thanks. It's called Riots I Have Known, and it is a kind of satirical book about how social media makes us monsters. And it's
that's just real life. That's just nonfiction, dude.
Yeah, I mean, it's not autobiographical, but it's set in a prison where the narrator is kind of confessing his crimes to the reader right before this giant riot comes and like consumes him. So it's a short read, and I don't know. Like my editor, the first thing he told me is he's like, I really like it. I think a lot of people are going to hate it. So that's like my expectation.
Okay. Like it's like Jonathan Franzen, but about Twitter.
Exactly. There was that gap in the market.
There was. I mean, that's what people have been waiting for.
So Ryan, do you think you're going to be an economy class writer, or are you going to be more of the business class writer?
I think I'm going to be like the Greyhound bus writer. if Dubravka is like economy class, I'm going to be just like hitchhiking with like a bindle stiff. And I'll be like that.
Yeah. Hey, you'd be surprised how much you can fit in a bindle.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
2 galleys.
Yeah.
Bindle absolutely has to be one of the greatest words ever invented, too.
So I wanted to share something with you guys before we get started.
Uh-huh.
I wanted to fit in on this podcast. And so my friend runs a EPL podcast called Always Cheating. And he sent me some tips or some sentences I can read to sound cool and in the know. Hold on. Let me see if I can convincingly do this. Thank goodness Pascal Gross is off penalty duty now. Glenn Murray is much better from the spot, and Brighton this season are going to need all the goals they can get. Is that real?
Sounds fairly legitimate.
Yeah.
Cool. I don't know what any of that means, but it sounds very soccer-y. Yeah.
Okay, thank God.
Don. I also you have the EPL, but we have the La Liga Valencia team mug today. Sponsored. This podcast is brought to you by La Liga in Valencia. So you're not fitting in again.
You must have an incredible sales team.
We are all over. We have sponsorships from all corners of the globe. Companies that are real, not real.
Just money just flowing in the open letter offices.
You can see all the high level equipment that surrounds me, including this in my office, this thermostat to show how goddamn cold it is in here in the winter time. It's like 45 degrees. and no one will fix our heat. But yeah, so that's the high level of promotion that podcasting. That's that podcasting money.
So you guys are an economy publisher, an economy class publisher.
We are a Bindlestick publisher for sure. Are you gonna? One last thing about your book. Are you gonna be at Winter Institute this next spring?
To be determined. I hope so.
You should push for it.
It'll be fun. I might just go and hang out, because I think you said that it's also fun not even to go to the conference, but to hang out at the parties and meetups.
Yep. I think Brian will be there possibly too. So we could all have one big Airbnb.
Excellent. I'll bring a bottle of whiskey.
Yes.
So this week we're talking about Fox, which I didn't mention at the top by Ugresic. Someone has music going.
So I tried to go outside, and now there's like the Eagles or something. So hold on, I'll move. I'll put it on mute. Keep going.
It's like a real life experience as Brian is at the beach. So we're going to be talking about part 6, The Fox's Widow, which is the final section of the book. Which you were just catching up on this, right, Ryan? You read most of this like in one fell swoop, right? Maybe if you can hear me, like,
yeah, I think Brian's looking for a good spot.
He'll get there. He'll get there.
I'm good.
And I happily read this most recently, so it's pretty fresh in my mind.
That's what I was going to say.
And I read this actually while I was in the Twin Cities. So, I read most of the book while I was in the Twin Cities on a family visit, and I was like in St. Paul when reading about Nabokov shitting on St. Paul. Oh, no. I was like walking by a jewelry store called Scheherazade, reading about Scheherazade. It was like very spooky.
That's really cool. You were there when they found the ruby red slippers too.
Yeah, that was front page news, Star Tribune.
Absolutely.
Probably.
Big deal. Big deal. So this section has 2 different kind of lines to it. One is the narrator's kind of reflections on being an economy class writer, which is a section I actually want to read maybe. But then also that's mixed in with her being an economy class writer, reflections on like the writing scene as a whole and being a writer, as she's going to go give a presentation at a school named after Holden Caulfield. To a bunch of students that are going to be artists of the future. So we have now, like this sort of reversal from like the section early on where the widow talks to the narrator and is like the older, more wizened person is like, here's how you can be, blah, blah, blah. Now we have the writer put into that role, talking to these younger artists who are like her, but not her, like doesn't have the same sort of interest that she had as a younger writer. And then at the same time, you have a counterbalance with her niece, talking to her and like her relationship with her niece and her niece's relationship to stories and to myths and to ideas and to fairy tales. So it's like a great time to reflect on like having gone through all these sort of iterations of being an artist, how to be an artist, how to be a fox, how to make it through the world, what kind of literature is important to be like now at that space where you're talking to the younger generations, maybe even two generations, about art. So it's a cool section, I think. And it's interesting way to wrap up the book.
Yeah, it's weird, sad, and kind of charming at the same time. I mean, obviously, her work is, very multifaceted, but I just found this one, again, just very, very charming and funny and sad, like all at once. I really enjoyed it quite a bit.
Yeah, and it seemed like it had a lot of the tenderness that you guys were talking about in the last episode, that she was working to, as she like turned the scope towards the future and the next generation, she was also putting in a lot more of the stories about the niece and that kind of heart aspect, because the niece had popped up briefly in the other sections, but she was more the focus, obviously, in Fox's Widow.
Right. Yeah, and she's an interesting sort of foil in a way, especially the section where they talk about the Descendants. It's called The Descendants, right? I meant to look this up. That Disney show where it's like my son's into this, or was, but it's the part on page 285 where she talks about the program that the niece is obsessed with, where it's all of the characters from Disney, like their children. and they all live on like an island, and they're all destined to be like their parents are. I believe it's called the Descendants or something to that effect.
Okay.
And it is a real show. The yeah, Descendants and Descendants 2 and Descendants 3. And I think that's a pretty interesting kind of part of that, where she's, knows all these stories through this new lens of like these new characters and these new sort of iterations on that, but that are all a little bit different and a little bit watered down.
Mm-hmm. and Ugresic definitely has fun with the reader's like assumption that she might be cast in the like old man, you kids get off my lawn role. And I like that she plays with that really well, where she's kind of like talking about different versions of different canons kind of throughout this. And she, I think there was a lot of like great use of humor in that. Like she kind of will complain about her back pain, and then shit at all of the School of Holden students for not knowing anything about literature. And it reminded me, there's certainly throughout the book, but especially in this section, this kind of like Jeff Dyer-esque or Bernhardian narrator, where there's a little bit of like the woe is me misanthrope used for comic effect to kind of, I guess, like create a kind of, certainly a humor in the book, so it doesn't get too dry or too academic, but then certainly she becomes like her own foil. So that as she's, you find that you're actually sympathizing with the younger students and with her niece more, and saying like, oh no, like Snow White's daughter has validity just as much as Scheherazade has validity for you.
I like the get off my lawn part. No, there is something about that too, in which like have you read her book Life is a Fairy Tale, or the story Life is a Fairy Tale? It's the what she references in the middle of this, or says something to the effect like, wasn't I all into this back when I was young? Yeah, oh yeah, 288. And besides, hadn't I some 30 years ago, at a time when I was burning with fervor, championed the literary notion of promiscuity among famous characters, so confident that I was the very first person in the world to think up such an idea? She had a story, I think it's called Life is a Fairy Tale, although I might be mixing up the stories, but there's one where like in this collection where the character's boyfriend or ex-boyfriend wants to borrow a character that she had written about, and it's within this context of like using characters over and over again. And also within that whole collection, she writes a lot about various fairy tales and how you can retell them or use that sort of structure to create new ways. And within this part, I think it's cool because it is sort of back to that Fox idea of you have the canon, and the canon has to be evolved or whatever. And so you're sneaking in these stories from the canon into a new way and sort of reclaiming that and making it different. And that does tie into what you're saying. Like, you sympathize with the niece. I'm not sure about sympathizing with the characters per se, but with that perspective of there is a way in which the canon can exist plus be sort of modified and added to and changed. And this book sort of is doing that. It's playing with those big names of the Nabokovs and the big Russian writers, and adding to that tradition in a way that's both subversive and like really smart and stands on its own.
Yeah, and then what do you guys think about like those? She really surfaces her theme of the author as kind of performing the role of the author, kind of within the world and within the book, which is kind of, it's always done with a, like, I would say not a wink, but kind of like a serious wink, because it's a central concern in the book. And then she gets explicit, I think, in like 273. She asks like, is it that I'm not acting the role of a writer well enough?
Yeah.
How did that strike you guys?
You can answer first, Brian.
I don't know. It kind of just, to me, it was kind of harkened back to like it echoed with the idea of footnotes and being a footnote and not having that person that's going to carry the torch on for her, or later in when it says just because I'm destined to be a narrator doesn't mean I don't want to have my own story. And I feel like there is this weird struggle and acceptance of what your role is and what your legacy can be. I found a few parts in here as well that that spoke to that for me. What do you think, Chad?
There's also like that balance that she constantly has between like what makes a work authentic and authenticity as a whole. That comes right after there too. Like, why do I so doggedly insist on authenticity at a time when fakers are the only ones who are taken seriously? Which kind of goes back to her whole like, if there's literature, but what literature makes it and what literature becomes the non-footnote? What books, what art becomes something that is the heralded, the business class of art? Like why do certain things get to that level and other things don't, is something I think that anyone in the industry sort of struggles with, but that she as a writer is struggling with, is being like, I'm trying to do these things and yet I'm not going to be that big popular author. And when you look at a lot of those things, they do feel like those characters, those authors, are almost caricatures of themselves, of like acting out their role as a writer to perform in a certain way that allows people to then access their works and become popular, and maybe not because of their artistic merit, but because they're performing a certain role that society wants from them. It sort of dovetails a bit with her like karaoke culture sort of idea of like people are better at like, mimicking things than they are doing their own thing. And that if you're really good at that, that's what you can succeed at. So like there's all those references to the books that the kids like at the school, and they're ones that are like that Aragon book that like 14-year-old kid wrote. All that shit that's like, that's super popular. And she wants to dismiss it all. And it's like, but it's more varied than like I expected. Like it's different. But there is like that I feel like that tension runs throughout this too, of like, it goes back to one of the early episodes where we talked about like, can you be a serious, like intellectually grounded author when you're going to lose when it's in the widow section, when she's like, you can't do that. You can't just be smart and be angry about it, because people don't want that. They want you to be this other way. And if you don't fit that role, they're not going to listen to you. You have to fit that role and then sneak in these other things first or after that.
No, it's fine. You'll just be, sitting in economy class, popping back pain medication, and people spilling your coffee when they lean back, right? I mean,
we did get her nice seats. We did get her the nice every part of her tour that's upcoming.
This was her like subtweet to Chad when she's like, I'm gonna put in my next book.
Dude, when we did Thank You for Not Reading, and there's a whole section about editors, and I read that and it's just like, this feels really close to home, like really close to
the character Blad most.
It's sort of like the part on 277. Publishers and other organizers of literary events are on the lookout for ways to squeeze a little money, often out of the embassies of the countries where their authors come from. And in the process, they draw the author into uncomfortable situations. They scrounge as best they can to cover the cost of the translation or promotion of the book, the publishing costs, or the author's honorarium. Although these are negligible sums, the embassies and the publishers have no money. Publishers explain this by saying the books by the writers for whom they're seeking support don't sell. The embassies reply that this is not their concern. And of course, they're right. The economy class authors are willing victims one way or another, and they usually have no idea of the little deals struck behind their back. Which is,
It echoes again, like with... Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say that in the idea of authenticity, like, she asks the question throughout the book, and the book to some degree is the answer, where if you... you're essentially doomed to be the hyper observer, which you can only get by traveling constantly and kind of being an outsider, and at the same time being as kind of ruthlessly honest as possible. And there are many times in the book where she says she has like kind of a knee-jerk responses, kind of lashes out at people, whether it's at like the conference where they get her name wrong. And they're like, we didn't think this would be a big deal. And she's like, surprise, I am that kind of author that will call out shit and embarrass you.
Oh, I am that petty.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I love that. I love that.
And by essentially kind of centralizing that honesty in the book, and by making kind of like her mode of inquiry, like the book itself, I think that is what she's proposing is like maybe one of the few avenues left for contemporary writers, or like not contemporary writers, but any writer who aspires to create literature. I wonder how much, because so much of the book is also about her own sense of like inability to find a home
Yeah, the refugee aspect I thought was really important with what you were saying. Yeah.
Yeah, and she creates those parallels with the refugee crisis, and I don't know how much we're supposed to take that, that sense of homelessness is now so pervasive as to be universal, and even people who haven't been exiled or who are refugees have a home either.
Well, how serious too is that the image of when she does, the narrator does explore that in the book, but it ends up just burning it all down and leaving.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. The free house.
I'll give it a shot to be comfortable and to have a garden and to relax and live the life. And it's just like, nope, burn it down and pee by the side of the highway. Like, not for me.
That's the new T-shirt.
Yeah.
You can find that in our merch store, which is sponsored by. It's funny. I was thinking of that as you're talking about like her quest of authenticity and the way that it sort of plays out. That we have a lot of books that are sort of like proof of concept books, where like the book itself affirms the ideas that author is playing within them.
Like Frazan,
Frazan is the other one that came to mind, and narrator Bragi Olufsen's new book. They're all like that, where they sort of take that issue and then show that it's possible through their own existence, the book's existence. She's a master at it.
She's, there's that like joke in The Princess Bride where Carrie Elway says like life is pain, and I think there's like a bit of that to the book and certainly The Fox's Widow, that she says like, in is the fox's curse to be essentially one who is castigated, one who is an outsider, one who is, by being the storyteller, like both inside and then outside of the tribe. And she kind of ratchets up her identification with the fox and her commingling with the fox in the end, but then kind of makes, almost like tells the young student who asks her what in storytelling we learn. She doesn't say it to her, but she thinks like, well, yes, but the price is quite high and you just have to be willing to live with that.
There's ways in which she like creates this kind of rhizomatic structure of like who's part of her tribe and what they're like, because there's a lot of threads of like the people. She's like, I can always recognize my people, both from the ex-Yugoslavs, because they're always like grumpy and grumbly and they have a certain look and a disdain. I recognize them. They're the Eeyores of the world. And then she ties that too to like the writers who are the business class aspiring writers that are like not trying to like perform but are trying to create. And she sort of starts tying together these little threads, women of the world that are excluded because they're women, people who are refugees who are excluded. Like she puts together through those like little connections, this other sort of tribe, this other sort of way of being. I think is really powerful. Like when you take it even at just at face value, as like that this can be a community of that sort of sensibility.
Now, how do you guys think, since I've only read Karaoke Culture and bits of American Fictionary, how does this fit in with some of her other like more explicitly fictional projects?
It's a little bit more layered, I think, than say Ministry of Pain, but it's been ages since I read Ministry of Pain. Same thing with the Museum of Unconditional Surrender, which I think is closest to this. But I think the Museum of Unconditional Surrender is a little bit more about the exile aspect of things and about creation that way, whereas this is a little bit more advanced in terms of the like talking about literature on a global scale and about the way that she plays these games. It's more Nabokovian in a way, and I think that those two novels I put next to each other. Fording the Stream of Consciousness is like very early and very like playful and a little bit more conventional in a sense, and Ministry of Pain is a little bit more in that vein. Baba Yaga laid an egg is like this though too, where it's like, I think I might have described this on an earlier podcast, but it's like a tripartite structure where there's like, forget if it begins with like a woman going back home, and then there's like a retelling of the Baba Yaga myth, and then the third part is a response to an editor who gets this book that was supposed to be written about the Baba Yaga myth and is like, the fuck is this? This isn't what we asked for. We asked for like 100-page book. And so it's like a series of responses to that editor being like, this is why this book is like this way. So it has that sort of thing too. And I'd put those three in like a line, and then Fording the Stream of Consciousness and Ministry of Pain are like a little bit different, but they're sort of, they're all like have the same sort of tonality and the same sort of intelligence, but they're a little bit different in kind of like their construction and their intricacy.
Do many of her works have, like, to me, there's a certain degree of difficulty with writing a book the way she does this one. Like, the only way I could liken it to was like when I'd go to summer camp and you could do crafts and you learn how to braid or like make a bracelet. And I could do 3, but then if you do 4, like the braid gets really hard. And then there's like really talented people that could do 6 or 7. Like, to me, this is like braided with so many different threads. It's super difficult, and she does it so effortlessly at the end to tie them all together. It's something I'm continually amazed at, and it was like, I have no idea how to write. Like, I can't do this at all. Like, I have no prayer to do this with this ease. Does she do that in her other books as well, or?
Yeah, definitely. And I think they're all working the same way, where it's like, if you can read it on the surface and be entertained and enjoy it, and then you can read it again and get the second and third levels of like, oh, this is way more like intricately constructed than I thought it was. Like, I thought this is just a book that went, because I think part of that might be like the way that we read rants, or the way that her essays have a ranting quality to them at times, where she gets on her role, and we sort of read those as like just going through that thought process and enjoying that. And then when the parts of this book, when it sort of does that it sort of takes over, has like a kind of tonality to that area, there's that section, but then there's all these little things that she laces in there.
My daughter's screaming for people to do a cannonball into the lake. Yeah, sorry.
Good idea. But I think that like it is a very Fox-like book, and that you're reading it on one level and getting it, but it's also sneaking in a lot of other little things.
Yeah, it probably sounds silly for me, but like, I really love reading her or Rodrigo Frazan, because I could never really hope to write the way they do, and so I don't have to compare myself to it at all, and I can just enjoy it so much. Whether if it's somebody that writes a similar way that I do, I'll end up comparing myself to it, or wondering, how are they doing this? Can I do that? Like with this, I know I have no hope or prayer to pull this kind of stuff off, and I could do the 3 braid, and this is like the the camp counselor braid. I'm just a little student, so.
Interestingly enough, there's a section in the 6th book of My Struggle that sort of speaks to this, where he's talking about like his own books, and says, "In my own eyes, I was a better writer than most. Only seldom did I read the work of another novelist and think I could never do this." Says, then goes on, "Then unattainable for me was closely bound up with the person who had written it. Thomas Bernhardt, for instance, what he wrote and achieved was completely out of my reach. Jan Fosse the same, but not a writer like Jonathan Franzen. Him I could match and probably even surpass." I read that and was like, this is a Ryan moment.
So I'm out of the loop. What is the joke with Franzen and Ryan?
Tom Roberge and Chad Post have a running antipathy to Jonathan Franzen, because they subscribe to what I think a lot of people would call a narrow view of literature.
Okay.
So, I've enjoyed reading Franzen for a long time, and I worked for a few years at FSG, and so they would always kind of rib me, and I'd be like, guys, like Freedom is really good, and they would be like, pshaw. So I was telling Chad earlier that I did look up like a lot of facts about St. Louis and Franzen just to sprinkle throughout the recording. So that I might, subtly convert Chad, bring him to the light.
I remember
Never gonna happen.
A very specific story in which we were making fun of some Franzen book, and you told me that you were listening to the podcast while you're folding clothes, and we're just like, God damn it, I hate you guys.
Oh yeah. This is my best laundry folding podcast, because then I can just punch my pillows, and there's no harm done. There are. You guys brought up the Mr. Difficult essay last episode. I like what Brian said, because it is a false method for looking at literature, and I think it was instructive to read. I think that was from like '96 or like early 2000s. It was a while ago, and then so many of the questions he's raising were essentially answered by writers the next like 18 years. Especially by someone like Karl Ove Knausgaard, who was trying to marry the personal and the domestic. with the world historical, which I gather he does a little bit more in the 6th volume.
I'm only
Isn't there
140
like
pages into a fucking 1,200-page book, so I don't know. Yeah.
there's like more than 100 pages on Mein Kampf, right? He just like
But I think there's a 600-page
starts talking about Hitler and
yeah.
jeez. But yeah, I think the one well, first off, quick aside, did you know that his hometown of St. Louis was the first U.S. city to host the Modern Olympics?
I did not,
Random
but
facts for you.
I believe they had a really egregiously, like, unpolitically correct, awful, like, Special Olympics that went alongside of that. St. Louis has a really, really checkered history when it comes to, like, race relations and, you know, human relations in general.
Yeah. Well, but the Mr. Difficult essay does bring up a lot of the same questions. So no, in all seriousness, like,
yeah.
you know, he's someone that is like deeply concerned with how do I, you know, create literature that can be mass. And he always used his father as an example, that his father didn't care about any author that wasn't on the cover of Time magazine, because growing up, Time magazine used to put authors on the cover. And that's obviously a lot of the same concerns that Fox brings up, but from a wildly different point of origin and with very different answers. And he was kind of like trying to see how much he could like open out and be read on a mass level. And Dubravka is essentially saying, like, I'm going to kind of write the way I write, and, you know, to some degree, like, not think about audience at all. It's certainly in Fox. Like, I don't know about as much with the other novels, but it does feel like in that way, like deeply, deeply personal fiction writing that, you know, finds its audience on its own terms in that way.
Right. There's something, I don't know how to frame this within the context of that too, but there's like a difference between his like wanting to be someone who's read by the masses and respected on some level. That's he wants that to be elevated, and she's more concerned with like being connected to the existing like canon and the forefathers that she respects the most, and sort of places that against the new age of like where things are digital and not they're tweets and they're not novels anymore, that there's like an erosion of that. She looks at it sort of like as the erosion of that sort of standard of literature, whereas he's always trying to raise up the masses, but he also won't go far enough because he doesn't want to embrace like the new in any way either. He's like a very middle mind sort of person.
Yeah, and they both have like a very, I think, adept sense of like marketing in the literary marketplace. And I think this is what like the widow section was primarily about, right? Like, right. You need a manager or like a coach for your career after you pass, and that's what it takes nowadays. You need a Vera, you know.
Yeah, especially to like and to keep your legacy alive and to make you last beyond being a footnote, beyond being just a moment. It's really, I mean, it's kind of sad too. The whole book has a bit of a sadness to it in that way.
What I liked, you know, have you guys seen Brazil, the film?
A long time ago.
Terry Gilliam?
Yeah, the Terry Gilliam film. There's like a scene at the end where Robert De Niro, I think, is the kind of insurrectionist character, and he like gets swallowed up by a tornado of newspapers, then disappears. Yeah. And that image came to mind in the last few pages of Fox's Widow, where she's like, you know, surrounded by foxes, like twining her legs, and then like escapes into the darkness. Yeah. And kind of like a self-effacement or like kind of a sacrificial element to, she's like, well, I've given you the book. This is what like the curse of the foxes. You're unloved, you're alone, you have to give everything. And then like the author disappears.
It's interesting
to give you like the book in your hand.
The other thing I was thinking, added on to that, I went back to the beginning, that Bulgarian folk song, kind of wondering, you know, I thought maybe it had to do with like kids and adults and singing and sharing, and it just happened to have a fox in it, so it fits. But then the end of it, there's that idea of the fox is killed and it's wrapped around the throat of a rich person, right? It's it's an adornment, or it's, and then it goes back to the business class and the economy. Like it ties in again with everything in there. There's that wonderful bit at the end where this wonderful little folk song has the fox dead, the fox gone, and it's the rich and the wealthy that get to flaunt it and have it out there, and there's no mention of the fox and its sacrifice. And again, it kind of made me think of like how many writers that do wonderful things or whatever, but it's the few business class ones that get to kind of, the world gets to notice or see. Or
and there's something another aspect to that, possibly even, where like the business class authors get to enjoy being the writer, whereas the economy class writers are just used for our entertainment. So the publishers use them to keep the publishing business going and to keep us in money, but we're not giving the authors the same. They don't get the treatment that the business class writers get. They get, they're underpaid, they're overworked, we use all these little deals to get them into like these weird situations, and they're sort of like the fox that becomes the trinket, or becomes like, oh yes, you can, you're good enough to come to our thing and entertain us, but we're not going to value you in the way that you deserve to be valued.
The Rescue the Story project did not necessarily also include a rescue the author clause, or
yeah.
It goes back to that economy class thing.
That was really great. The part with the fox too, the last part of it on 307, like the fox is neither of the beasts nor us people, nor is it of the gods. It is forever a stowaway, a migrant moving with ease through worlds. And when it's caught without a ticket, then it spins balls on its tail, performs its cheap tricks. The flash of admiration it receives out of the myopic susceptibility of the fox is its substitute for love. These are its glory days. It's kind of that little like performance for that miner to be able to get away, to be able to keep on the move and keep around instead of being, cherished in a different way. There's something too, like I was gonna say, we're going back to that too, where she talks about like the authenticity, or like the value of art and all that. It's that part on 301 where she's like ripping on all the she's like, why do I get irked by the online sales of the little sadomasochistic trinkets mentioned in a porno novel that sold millions of copies? Why am I so appalled by the writing tips app that an author of children's hits came up with that could be downloaded on one's smartphones? And it is that whole like, I like her awareness, like her own, like you said at the beginning, of her being her own foil, of like the narrator just like, yeah, I know that this isn't, that I shouldn't be upset about these things. Like I have these trinkets, I have fucking like Pushkin Matryoshka doll on my desk. Like I have that merchandise too, but like my merchandise is okay. This stuff is shitty. And like that, it's always like one of those hard things to deal with or to reconcile of like, I'm upset about this, even though I know I shouldn't be. And like, why is the literature I like considered so much better when people are just reading Aragon and 50 Shades of Grey?
Yeah. And she's
Jonathan Franzen.
And then she brings up, she's like, when I was younger, she's like, I loved A Love Story. And she's like, I cried to the, like quote unquote, like lowbrow entertainments.
Yeah.
I mean, the other thing is that there is hope in the book, right? She's not like a nihilist, like kind of going back to the rant aspect. But it's like, where do you guys think she locates her hope? Like, where is she saying like the answer is?
That's a good question. That's one I don't know I can answer, so my boat's here. I'm probably just going to leave when I answer that.
Do you have a favorite line?
Think about that on the water all day.
That works out perfect for me. Yeah, I agree. Where is that hope from?
I would like that to, like, whoever's listening to this or watching, I'd like you guys to respond to that too.
The hope is in the footnote.
The hope is in the footnote. The hope is that that you can take something and create a story, maybe.
Yeah. Well, it does mention that in this too. Where do stories come from?
Yeah, and it's like we know how, we just don't know where.
Yeah, how a story comes about.
Do you have a favorite line you want to end with, Brian, before you have to run?
Yeah, let me do it real quick here. Hold on. Again, I like this one. I'd mentioned early on 286. Just because I'm destined to be the narrator doesn't mean I don't want to have my own story.
Yeah.
I feel like that kind of sentiment is throughout the book, all over the place. And I enjoyed it quite a bit. You don't have to be Franzen to have a voice. Even if your book sales are lower, you still matter.
there's a hope of finding that. There's a hope within a lot of her books that frequently a character who comes along who is studying the author's works on some level, that there's like a passing down of that and of that received knowledge. And maybe it ties into this kind of Fox's widow sort of aspect of like that figure being able to pass something down that's meaningful and that does stay. Maybe it's just longevity. Maybe it's just that idea. The hope is that you can have readers into the future. You can have your voice heard and not just have it be like subsumed by the fact that like it's not a performative author piece of, you know, bauble that exists for like 18 months and is remaindered and never talked about again. That there is a way that you can create something that might not be on Nabokov's level in terms of audience and like thesis projects, but is something that connects with that.
Yeah, I do apologize. I got to run, but hopefully I'll get to cross paths with you again pretty soon. All right, Ryan?
Cool. Good to Ryan.
Take
care.
Have
fun, man. Enjoy your pontoon. So I don't have a ton of other things I was going to mention, but do you have a favorite line from this that you really liked?
I mean, Brian mentioned one of my favorites. I thought just as, you know, she quotes the Boris Pilniak line a lot of the if the spirit of the fox enters a person, then the person's tribe is accursed. The fox is the writer's totem. I thought that was, you know, certainly like the key that unlocks the book for me. And when in the first section, when she was talking about Boris Pilniak, I had a hard time kind of entering the book because I thought, is this going to be, you know, experimental on that level of like an academic research project that she slyly inserts autobiographical details into, and I liked that it opened up, but it makes a lot of sense towards the end because obviously the book was titled Fox, so it's no surprise, but she has kind of developed that idea so thoroughly and across, I know, literary history, kind of Eastern European history, present like marketplace conditions for authors, and then you kind of see how she can kind of insert it into the future. When she's talking to a student at the school of Holden, who she says, you know, who knows, this woman might be writing a book that incorporates me, you know, 20 years. And I don't know, it felt like one of those books that once you read it will have an effect on the way you read the next few books, if not, you know, several books, you know. In a lifetime. It kind of reorients a way of thinking about literature and a way of thinking about storytelling. It's certainly not in a rah-rah way, but certainly not in a nihilistic way either.
Right. Yeah. It complicates it in some way, and it helps deepen it in a sense.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really excited to hear what she has to say in conversation with Martin Amis at the Brooklyn Book Festival.
That's gonna be wild.
It's going to be great. Yeah, and I think they will be kindred spirits in that, as to veterans of the writing circuit and traveling the world to kind of be something of a brand, or someone who is trying to escape the reputation. Him more so,
right?
But yeah, and you know, he's also someone who is like deeply concerned with like how does storytelling. He sees it as like primal, and he's something of a traditionalist, certainly in like money and the information.
Right.
But yeah, that's going to be fascinating.
That is, yeah.
I'm rambling.
No, that's okay. For anyone listening to this, it'll be a week, I guess. September 16th is the date that of the Brooklyn Book Festival this year. And she'll be in two panels, one at 1 o'clock and one at 5. And the one at 5 is a conversation with Martin Amis. All the information is on the Brooklyn Book Festival website. It's also on 3% under the Dubravka US tour details, because we have her going to a bunch of different cities throughout the US, starting, I think she gets to the US next Monday, which is why she's gonna come on the podcast next week to talk about everything we were wrong about.
Exactly.
Hopefully.
How about for you? So you've obviously worked in this book plenty and are much more intimate with it than like first time readers.
Although yes and no, because I read it when we got the manuscript, and we were trying to win over and be able to sign on a few books by her, especially because and probably said this too, but especially because American Fictionary, which comes out now, is exactly 10 years from when we published our first book as Open Letter, which was by Dubravka as well. So we really wanted that sort of bookend sort of symmetry. So I read it when we were doing it then, and then I read it to proof it. And in the meantime, Kaya worked with the translators to edit it. So I was in between, and then I reread it now, and I use it in my class, which was like, I hope my students don't listen to this, but like semi-infuriating, because they were like, really didn't seem to get it. And like one of the main complaints was there wasn't enough fox in it. They didn't understand like why it would be called that when there wasn't like enough explanation of like the fox myth in Eastern European history and things like that. And I was, at the time I was just sort of like stunned, and I hadn't reread it for class because I was like, no, I'm going to reread it for the podcast. You know, I can make do for this one session of class. And I was just like, that seems baffling to me. And I don't know how to explain to you guys that the whole book is that. And then doing this has really like reopened up and going so slowly. I mean, you worked in publishing, you're reading stuff constantly. That's like, you got to take a gist sometimes and just go with it. And being able to slow down with this book is really cool. Like it's been I enjoyed reading it before, but this has been one of the more fulfilling like book reading experiences of the year for me, because it does give so much, and it gives so much to think about. And so every week, like picking it up to do the next section, I was like, okay, this is going to be, what is this going to entail? Like I remember the general outline, but I'm like, now with this new enhanced sort of vision to it, it's bringing so much more. I mean, it really is like one of our listeners commented on how like they wish that they had listened to the podcast before they started grad school, because it sort of explained close reading and to them in a way that that had been talked about but never like worked through in like a live 8-hour program.
Yeah.
Like you sort of see like, yeah, that's a good term. And like, if you're a smart professor, you can like pick things out and make it all amazing and like magical. But like that process of actually trying to figure shit out as you're going through it is fun. I think that's why I would like doing these podcasts. I hope people like listening to them, is because we do sort of like uncover things and find them as we go along, and it changes the whole nature of how to look at that book.
Yeah, I think that I could see this being challenging if you were an undergrad reading this, because the book rewards having a kind of a base of knowledge, not only about her play with the rotation of the Bokov and not storytelling, but I guess a better way to say it is, she writes the way that like kind of a lot of the more brilliant comedians work now, where they know that the setup, punchline, and the template for many different kinds of jokes, and their diversion from it is where a lot of the comedy lies.
That's true.
And I think she does something similar, where she presumes a base of readership and a kind of foundation of the classics that really enhances reading Fox. At the same time, though, I don't know if you guys mentioned this here, but it's like what they say to read like Ulysses or Garby's Rainbow. Just like first time, just read it.
Yeah.
Don't even think about the structure. Don't even think about the symbolism. Don't even think about what's going on. You'll get that on the second pass, and that the book is fun the first time and then like revelatory the second time.
I completely agree with that. And also like related to Ulysses, which I reread that last summer, and was like, I'd read it when I was whatever, like 18 or 19. And then, 20 years later, and it's like wholly different book to me. And this book might have some of that at play too, where like you sort of switch your identifications with the narrator. The narrator's different ages throughout this book, but like at those different ages, it sort of adapt the different viewpoints. Like I think even like 15 years ago, it'd have been like, man, you don't need to like pretend with this like crap. Like you should just be able to be, aggressive and like experimental and literary, and that's fine. And people should just respect that. And then that idea morphs as time goes along. So I think coming back to this at different points in life might even give people a different sort of response to it. So how to be a fox when you're 22 versus when you're 80, and what those different relationships are.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's exciting. I feel lucky that I got to talk about the Fox's Widow section and then kind of the book in total, because she does like what Brian says, she ties these threads together. And I think going back to like the question the book poses is answered by the book itself. It is kind of like what the Bernhard thing that Karl Ove talked about. It's it's a book that could only have been written by her.
Yeah.
And her doing so with like extreme rigor. Because I imagine for her to write this book may have been somewhat, you know, um, less, no, not that difficult, but then editing it must have been insane, where she's collecting like observations, literary history, academic history,
Yeah.
journals, and diary. Yeah.
That research is intense. And I know that she works with like a few different readers who read her and give her feedback, but like that's, yeah, I think a lot of it is done on her own. I'm going to ask her about that. It's funny, like, as we've been talking about this, like, it's always hard to explain. Like, people be like, what kind of books do you publish? And like, it's usually like translators or authors or agents. And, you know, then it's always like some facile dumb answer of like, you know, cool books, good books, whatever. But like, it really, I mean, we do a lot of different things, but the ones that really stand out and that are going to last as be like markers of an open letter book are ones that do have this kind of like proof of concept. They change the way you think about books as a whole and how to read them. And there's something else that you said in that like the threading of them. What was it that you said right before that? I forget. There's another thing that was like, that's another aspect to like a sort of open letter book is the way that those two things, and then a third thing I forgot because I forgot. But it's something you reminded me of when you were just talking. But those seem to be like a good open letter sort of books. They sort of explain what we're up to.
Yeah,
books that reward that second reading, I guess, that are that sort of level of like you go back to them and they've changed and they've grown for you, and they're not just like something that you can read once and forget about. That there's something that, as you come back, rewards a second reading. So like those three things put together sort of define a certain ideal for what we'd like to be publishing. So it's cool that we've been able to cover a few of them on this podcast so far.
Yeah, you know, thinking about like open letter writ large, like there are certainly overlaps with Fox and Tirza Arne Grunberg's book, and you know how much I love Enard's Zone.
Oh yeah,
where you know there's kind of like a you know close interiority to the narrator / author figure, who is using that to you know cover, especially in Zone, you know like a lot of historical ground.
That's
but there's like a manic quality, and like all of these books are essentially like teaching you how to read them at an accessible level, not like you know one that demands like Joycean levels of close reading or scrutiny, but that you know when you guys were talking about this and Fox on one of the earlier episodes, I thought like it's like the difference between you know enjoying a pop song and then like listening to you know, something experimental, which then kind of, you know, I don't know, I'm not very good at talking about music, but listening to like a minimalist piece where you're learning like, okay, well, like the changes within the repetition are where the beauty might lie. That's a whole other concept of like listening to music. And I think that is certainly true of some of the approach to a lot of the open letter texts. They're not like beach reads, but, you know, if you're reading it on the beach, then you might like forget to like, you know, get out of the sun and go in the water, join your family.
You'll get absorbed. I remember the third thing I was going to say was it's the voice where it's like a voice that can never be. The book could only have come from that author. Like Zone could only have come from Enard. Physics of Sour could only have come from Gostadinov. These books are like wedded with that voice, that perspective, and the way that they're told. It's singular in that sense. And I think that a lot of our like most notable books fall into that camp in one way or another.
Do you have final Dubravka thoughts, Fox thoughts?
I don't, because we'll talk to her next week, but I did have one line that is going to be my last favorite line from this, since I continue with the darker version of them. God, where'd it go? I had it here. I will find it. Yeah, here it is. So I like on 267. True, there's also an exhilarating ingredient in the cocktail of back pain and gripes. Grumbling, grousing, moaning, whinging, groaning, and belly aching have a palliative effect. They act like diazepam, which I'm on board with. So it's it's dark but not dark. Sometimes you just bitch and moan because it feels better.
Yeah, I don't know why I thought, or I'm that struck a chord with you, Chad. But
That's what I think. I don't think that most. I want to think with the things that I write on our blog. I think sometimes people think that those are really actually like legitimately serious, and sometimes there's bits, but the vast majority of it is just like making fucking dumb jokes and just complaining for like the joke of the complaint, and because it feels good to like really exaggerate those bits. Like there is. I find it incredibly relieving, but like if you take it super on face value serious, like this person's insane. But like it's not meant that way. It's always meant with like a tongue-in-cheek sort of like, this is just done for entertainment.
Well, you're performing your role as publisher. We'll
I'm performing a role in that point. I am performing a role as angry blogger. 100%. That is the role that is supposed to be. And I can get into it and I can unload it and it's super fun. And it's not like the rest of my day.
Exactly.
Like the big secret. I don't think, but it is. I think it's weird in today's world. Like I do one last thought that does relate to that, and maybe relates to Fox. Is it's weird in this world because we don't have that separation as much anymore. Like there isn't the separation between the author and the works in the way that there was before our current like digital revolution, and so there isn't like people don't see that as a gap. Like if you write something, you're writing it as yourself. Your Twitter is you, not really like a performance. And when people do try and perform, it's frequently like misinterpreted or really angers people to like a weird extent. So it is kind of it is part of our world, and I think it's something that she sort of gets at as like you're not removed anymore. We're all sort of connect to that.
I would love to hear her thoughts on that next week because and I'm sure it's pernicious. Like everybody must be asking her that wherever she goes about misinterpreting that like she is her narrator.
Yeah.
And that it is nonfiction. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I think that comes up a lot. I mean, she does write a lot of nonfiction that's from the same sort of voice with the same sort of like sort of narrator that fits kind of her shape more or less, or seems like it could be her. That it does start to blend together. But like this book is clearly fiction. It's clearly a novel. It's not essayistic. It's not that. It's like playing with those ideas, but it's not. It is a novel. But so anyway, so next week, everyone tuning in, next week Dubravka will be joining us to talk about Fox and about her tour and about American Fictionary and about her work as a whole. And you can always find us like on the YouTube page, on the YouTube channel for 2 months review, and at @open_letter on Twitter. And I'm at Chad W. Post on Twitter. And you are Chapman?
2 Chapmans.
Just 2 Chapmans. 2 Chapmans.
Yeah.
Chapman on Twitter.
Yeah.
Your book comes out in May?
May. It's called Riots I Have Known. If you pre-order it based on this podcast, I will buy Chad the most expensive whiskey when I see him, and then we'll send you photos of him slamming it and then slurring when he runs his event. We can live
vlog that, or we can Vine me doing a shot of expensive whiskey.
I want the more successful I ever get in life to correspond with the destruction of your liver. And then they'll be connected.
I wouldn't be opposed to that.
Good.
Let's just say I'm okay.
Apologies, Akaya. Yeah.
Oh, man. Okay. Well, thank you very much again for joining us.
Yeah. Thanks for having me on.
I'll talk to you soon.